I'm talking today to Dr. Konrad Hirschler, who is a reader at the School of Oriental and African Studies, London, and we're talking about the Crusades, which is your area of expertise. Set the scene for us. Over what period did the Crusades take place?
Well, from a Middle Eastern perspective, the Crusades really started to play a role from 1098 onwards, when the first armies arrived in northern Syria, and they remained on the Middle Eastern mainland for roughly 200 years until 1291. From a European perspective, the Crusades continued for many more centuries, and we see them in different theaters of war. But from a Middle Eastern perspective, it's really from 1291 onwards the Crusades disappear from the political landscape.
And 200 years is a long time, isn't it?
Yes. They certainly accompanied Middle Eastern history over a very crucial period of transformation, where we see the crystallization of an increasingly centralized political landscape in the Middle East.
And were the Crusaders colonial conquerors?
Well, colonialism is obviously a modern concept and implies that there is an imperial colonial center to which basically the material surplus of the colonies is shipped off, and that there is a exploitation relationship between center and the colony, which we don't see as clearly for the crusading period. And most importantly, there's not a distinct center in Europe which would control these Crusader states, the four Crusader states which were set up in the Middle East, but it's a much more complex relationship between the European center, so to say, and the actual Crusader states in the Middle East.
And in those days people were much less apologetic about seizing other people's land.
Oh yes. I mean, we are not in a period where we have clearly distinct borders and frontier line, and where there would be an uproar if one specific group moved over the territory of another group. But we have a much more fluid landscape, and as far as we are able to tell, the vast majority of the people did not have supra-territorial identity in the sense of I am a Syrian and I have a clear sense of where the Syrian borders are, or I am a Palestinian, or I am a Frenchman for that sense, or I'm a German. But that obviously was a much more fluid situation.
What was Jerusalem as a place in terms of the other cities in the region?
Jerusalem was a minor city within Syria. If we would look at the larger Middle East, obviously it would be a tiny city, but even within Syria it's a minor city which had no political importance. Jerusalem had not been the political center of a dynasty for several centuries. It was of very marginal economic importance, as it did not lay on the main trade routes crisscrossing Syria, north, south and east, west. And even in religious terms, it's not as straightforward as people often imagine today. For example, we have a pilgrim guide written by a Syrian from this period, and he has a lot of things to say about Damascus and how important it is to visit Damascus, but on Jerusalem it's rather brief what he has to say. And as far as we are able to say, Damascus was of more religious importance than Jerusalem in the pre-Crusading period.
And indeed, contemporaries were more worried by the fall of Antioch than they were necessarily by what would happen to Jerusalem.
As far as we are able to tell from those texts which have survived today, the marker of the First Crusade was indeed the fall of Antioch, and Antioch was a major city. It was of economic importance, and it was a large population center, and so the fall of Antioch was much more seen as the marker of what happened during the First Crusade.
Why is the conquest of Jerusalem in 1099 and the subsequent massacre of the Muslim population emblematic of the difficulties of understanding what actually happened?
Well, it's emblematic in the sense we have a very rich Latin historiography on these events, and there are many European authors who write in much detail about these texts, about these events. But from the Middle Eastern side, we have only a very limited corpus of texts who write about this period, and our main challenge for the first 40 years or so of crusading history is that Middle Eastern authors were just not interested in the events, which seems surprising for us today, as we believe the Crusades were an all-changing event and they're absolutely central to medieval history. From a Middle Eastern perspective, they were a rather marginal event. They were never able to conquer an important city. And thus, even for an event such as the conquest of Jerusalem, we basically have around 8 lines in the entire Arabic historiography, which is contemporary to the events.
And those 8 lines, what do they say relative to the later accounts that were given, both in terms of the massacre and the motivations?
The massacre, as it is represented in later texts, is not mentioned. The only explicit reference to a massacre which we do have is a reference to the massacre of the city's Jews, the Jewish population. Seemingly they were put in a synagogue and the synagogue was, quote, burned over their heads. But apart from that, the contemporary sources do not mention outstanding massacre, except for one single source, which is complicated because it's an outsider. He comes from Spain and has only briefly visited the region, but the local sources, especially the Syrian sources which are written in the area, do not inform us about a massacre.
And the figure of 70,000, which is given by this later source, is that likely to have been credible?
No. Jerusalem simply did not have a population of 70,000, and even if there had been large-scale refugee movement from the surrounding areas, of which we have no indication whatsoever, but assuming that there would have been refugee movements, again, a town as small as Jerusalem at that point would not be able to accommodate 70,000 people. And the number 70,000 is a medieval figure, it's a symbolic figure, it's only from a modern perspective. When a modern reader reads a number, he or she obviously assumes this is a statistical information and with certain assumptions it has to be correct. A medieval reader would have never had such an assumption. They were aware that this number is a symbolic number. And
it just meant lots.
It meant lots, and it clearly had eschatological and apocalyptic association, as the number 7, not only in the Islamic but also in the Jewish and Christian tradition, is obviously a very important symbolic number. And in the Islamic tradition, for example, there's a saying that 70,000 prophets are buried on the mountains around Jerusalem. So the number 70,000 is not only many, but many with a very specific connotation, transporting additional ideas of eschatology.
And these kinds of massacres after the taking of a city during this period were pretty much standard practice.
Yes, if a city was besieged and did not surrender, but was taken by the sword, so to say, the conqueror was, according to the international law of warfare, the unwritten one, was entitled to enslave the population or to massacre the population. And with a very high degree of probability, after the fall of Jerusalem, we have some massacre going on, because the city was taken by the sword, and it would be very unlikely that these Crusaders did not commit some acts of massacre. But the silence by the contemporary Arabic sources clearly implies that for these authors what happened was nothing unusual, but was clearly within the framework of what one expected conquerors to do, be they Muslim, be they Christian, with the only exception of the Jewish synagogue, which they mention.
The period of 200 years we're talking about is often represented as a period of kind of constant confrontation between the Crusaders and the local population, whereas in fact the Frankish and Muslim warlords were not in constant conflict. Indeed, they were close at different times. How and why did they seek to make alliances with each other?
This clearly differed over the 200 years period, and it's impossible to make one statement for the entire 200 years. But for example, if we look at the early crusading period, let's say the first 40 years after the arrival of the Crusaders, what we see is that the Crusaders were integrated into the political landscape of Syria with a breathtaking speed. And only 5 years after the conquest of Jerusalem, we see for the first time that Muslims and Crusaders are fighting side by side against another coalition of Muslims and Christians, Crusaders and Muslims. And this is tendency which we see during the first fourth decade very frequently, because Syria was highly regionalized, decentralized. We have many small lordships, and these small lordships were willing to ally with other lordships across religious borders, and the Muslim lords certainly had no problems to ally themselves with Crusaders, and vice versa. The Crusaders had no problem to ally themselves with the Muslims in the area.
And people would switch sides?
That's difficult to trace, but we know that the Crusader states employed Turco-Poles, they were called, which were soldiers at least of Muslim descent, who had a Muslim background. And from indirect references we are aware that there were also Franks, Crusaders, who fought occasionally on the Muslim side. And most famously during the Crusade of Frederick II in the 13th century, part of his army was clearly Muslims. So we have Muslim soldiers fighting under the cross against Muslim to retake Jerusalem.
And these Muslim soldiers, were they Christians, or did they remain Muslims?
No, they remained Muslims. They came from southern Italy, where we have a very strong Muslim presence at this point, and Frederick II, in some periods of his rule, made sure that his elite troops are taken from these Muslim populations. And when he went on crusade, he took part of his elite troops on this crusade, and so we have this rather absurd situation that we have Muslims fighting on a cross against Muslims.